Hey, what's going on, everyone? Greg here, and let me ask you a question. Is today an exciting day, or is it a boring day? Depending on who you ask, you might get a different answer. But for me, I try and be an optimist on this channel, and I am excited because today we have the new 13-inch M2 MacBook Pro. Now, if you're a pessimist, you might go, okay, well, this isn't exciting. It's the same exact design as last year's M1 MacBook Pro, which design goes all the way back to 2016, and there's really nothing new here except the M2 chip. But if you're an optimist and you're excited like I am, this is the first next generation Apple Silicon Mac with the M2 chip inside of it. The MacBook Air isn't out yet, and on top of that, even if the MacBook Air was out, this is going to be the most powerful M2 Mac available, at least for now, because it has the active cooling system inside of this. So this computer is going to get you the most potential and possibly the most power out of that M2 chip. And that in itself is exciting. Now, skipping over the boring parts, it's not like I need to unbox this thing, right? It looks exactly the same, like I said, as last year's M1 model. And even internally, there's really no changes here. There's no new speaker system. There's no new microphone system. The keyboard is exactly the same. And guess what? Yes, it still even has a touch bar. We've heard all these things before. We've said all these things before. Webcam, still exactly the same. Still a 720p webcam. Display, still exactly the same. Still a Retina display with the P3 wide color gamut. No mini LED display. Still maxes out at 500 nits of brightness. So everything new about this MacBook Pro really is just that new M2 chip. And the first exciting thing you'll notice if you open up Geekbench is that the M2 chip is clocked higher than the M1 chip. I believe it goes all the way up to 3.49 gigahertz on the clock speed, and that is obviously faster than the M1's 3.2 gigahertz clock speed, which means that each individual core on the M2 chip is stronger. And we have not seen this yet in any other of these other M1 chip iterations. The M1, the M1 Pro, the M1 Max, the M1 Ultra, they all share the same base clock speed, which means that with single core performance, it's all the same, but on the M2, we should see higher single core performance, and as a consequence of each core being individually stronger, even though it's the same 8-core CPU as the M1 chip, we should see higher multi-threaded performance as well. So let's go ahead and run a Geekbench benchmark and let's see if our theory is true. And as Geekbench finishes out, well, the theory was confirmed. We get a single core score of 1,911. That is the fastest single core performance on any Mac ever. An M1 chip, for comparison, would usually get you somewhere in the 1700 range, anywhere from like 1700 to 1750. You can also see that the multi-core is improved as well. So now we're getting an 8,794 on the multi-core score. Again, if we were to compare it to the M1s off the top of my head, I believe they scored in around the 7,400 range for the multi-core performance. Now, if you've watched my channel for a while, you know that Geekbench is not an intensive benchmark. It's a good benchmark to use though, because it is cross-platform, so we can run it on computers, phones, tablets, all that stuff. So we can kind of get a cross-reference score of all those devices. But if we want to load up a more intensive benchmark, well, we're going to need to use something a little bit more intensive, and luckily we have that. So this is Cinebench. This is a way more intensive benchmark. We'll actually see if we can hear the fans as we run this benchmark, and then we'll also get to put that multi-core performance more through its paces. So as I run Cinebench, as I said, it's a more intensive benchmark, right? And here's something that surprised me when I started running this. Now, we weren't really sure going into this what the thermal architecture of these new MacBooks would be with the M2 chip inside of it. We know based on Apple's presentation that the M2 should be almost as energy efficient, or maybe even the same energy efficiency as the M1 chip, but when it comes down to testing, is that really true? The M2 chip is slightly larger than the M1, which would kind of say that maybe it isn't as energy efficient as the M1. And running this Cinebench benchmark, there was one thing that kind of caught me off guard. And that was that I heard the fan spin up on it. Now, I didn't hear the fan spin up on it until really the end of the test, and it wasn't like a super loud like jet engine fan like we had in the Intel days, but it was definitely noticeable, and I think I would have to cross-reference this against an M1 MacBook Pro to really be sure, but if I remember correctly, when I did my M1 MacBook Pro, when I did the first benchmark on Cinebench, one of the things I was really impressed about was that I didn't even hear the fan spin up, but I did on the M2, which to me maybe is saying that maybe this M2 chip is using a bit more energy than the M1. And that's going to be really interesting to test out when we get the M2 MacBook Air, because that does not have an active cooling system. So that M2 MacBook Air might actually thermal throttle a little bit more than the M1 Air. But again, that's all speculation on my end. Do not take that as scientific fact. We still have to do a lot more benchmarking on this. And yeah, so it's just a little tidbit I noticed when running this benchmark. But as we finish out the Cinebench benchmark, you can see that we got a score of 8,499, which is about 1,000 points higher than we got on the old M1 chip. Now, perhaps one of the bigger leaps with the M2 chip wasn't necessarily with CPU performance, even though we are seeing some nice CPU performance gains, especially in single core performance on the M2 chip. The GPU was the area where we actually saw a bigger increase, because not only were the GPU cores stronger on the M2 chip, but we actually got more of them this year. So this MacBook Pro comes by default with a 10-core M2 GPU. So let's go ahead and run a graphics benchmark. Now for this benchmark, we are going to be using Geekbench, and we are going to be using the Aztec Ruins high tier 4K off-screen benchmark for this particular test. And as we run through this benchmark, you can see that the M2 chip is scoring 3,151.75 frames for an overall 49 frames per second. If you compare that to the M1 chip, that got 2,304 frames and 35.8 frames per second. So again, a pretty significant jump here in GPU performance, at least with this benchmark. Another benchmark I love to run on Macs to first test them out is the disk speed test. Now, this is going to measure just how fast the SSDs are in this Mac. Obviously, the new MacBook Pros, or I guess they're not new anymore, the 2021 14 and 16-inch versions, if you got the higher tier storage, the 4 and 8 terabyte versions, they had super fast SSDs. I don't think we're gonna see that type of performance here, but these still should be pretty speedy. And running the disk speed test, we can see that the read and write speeds on this are pretty snappy. So on the write speed, we're usually getting around 2,300 in write, and on the read, we're getting around 2,700, 2,800 megabytes a second. So not as fast as the 7.4 gigabytes per second we would see on the new MacBook Pros with those higher tier storage SSDs, but you can't even get those configurations on the 13-inch model. It maxes out at a 2 terabyte drive. So still plenty fast. I think it matches the lower tiered storage SSD speeds found on the MacBook Pros. All right, well, as you know, benchmarks are just benchmarks. They give you an idea of real world performance, but they don't really emulate it. Now, there's a lot of different tasks out there. You could be in music production, development, 3D modeling, a lot of stuff, right? I'm on YouTube, right? You're watching this on YouTube right now. I do video editing. So what I usually do is I usually do some export tests on Final Cut Pro on any new Mac I get to see how speedy it is. So let's go ahead and do that right now. Now, video editing and video exporting, all that stuff is traditionally a really good test of measuring the CPU and the GPU. But the M2 is a little different this year because it actually has dedicated video engines for H.264 and ProRes video, which should make it handle those files better. When I reviewed the M1 Pro version of the 14 and 16-inch MacBook Pro, that dedicated media engine made a huge difference in how fast it exported those files and just the smoothness of editing those files in Final Cut Pro. So, but let's stick to our basic export test for now. At first, we're gonna do an export in H.264. These exports are gonna be with 10-minute 4K clips, very simple files, no color grading, no LUTs, no effects, just very simple video files that you would pull off your camera. And you can see that the M2 MacBook Pro doesn't look too bad, right? It's exporting this in 5 minutes and 4 seconds. Now, this isn't that impressive because when I reviewed the 14-inch MacBook Pro, when I did a video export test, it was faster. The M1 Pro chip is still faster, even with that binned 8-core version, and that finished the export in 4 minutes and 44 seconds. Now, again, not a big difference, right? We're basically talking about 20-second difference in export times, and obviously this is a much cheaper computer. The M1 Pro MacBook Pro starts at $2,000, so still pretty good performance for this machine. Now, one of the things I loved about the new M1 Pros was that dedicated media engine was an absolute beast when exporting ProRes video. And on the M2 machine, it looks like it is faster at exporting than H.264. It's going to finish that test out in about 3 minutes and 25 seconds. But when you look at the M1 Pro, that finishes out exporting that 4K file way faster at 1 minute and 20 seconds. So that is just a beast if you have to deal with ProRes video footage. The M2 may have half the power with that video encoder, but still, even though this is the next generation of Apple Silicon, it's still no match for handling ProRes. The M1 Pro is still just really good at ProRes video files, so that might be a consideration you want to make. But either way, this still did good. But I was really thinking back to the speed tests I did here, and I tried watching older videos when I did benchmarks on the 2020 M1 MacBook Pro, and the speed seemed similar. I was getting very confused. So I wanted to compare this directly against the 13-inch M1 Pro MacBook Pro. Now, unfortunately, I just installed a developer beta of macOS Ventura on this machine, so the performance on this should actually be a little bit slower, but I don't think it matters because I did the same exact H.264 export on that MacBook Pro and this new M2 MacBook Pro, and something startling kind of happened. They both basically finished the export at the same exact time. And I'm trying to piece together why this is. Is there something on the macOS Ventura beta that is accelerating Final Cut Pro? Is the M1 machine faster and it's actually being held back by macOS Ventura? Maybe, but these aren't fair comparisons either way, because what I think is happening is there's an advantage in performance happening on that M1 machine because it has more memory. My M1 MacBook Pro has 16 gigabytes of memory. This base model only has 8 gigabytes of memory. And what we know about the Apple Silicon architecture with performance when dealing with these larger files is that if it doesn't have to swap, that's going to result in faster performance. So what I think is happening here is that if you have an older M1 machine and you actually have more memory than what this M2 machine is, you might not see any difference in performance. You might actually be better off with an older M1 machine with more memory. I know no one's really probably going to go on that upgrade path of having an old M1 machine and then downgrading to or maybe upgrading to an M2 machine and then putting lower memory configurations on it. But it is something to be made aware of. I need to do a lot more tests surrounding this. This was kind of a revelation to me. So maybe I'll try and address this in another video. I didn't order a M2 MacBook Pro with a higher memory configuration, but that's something I'm going to be on the lookout for as I start to do more tests, especially with the M2 MacBook Air, how much ordering a higher memory configuration will actually affect performance of this machine. But either way, that's the end of our benchmarks for this. Still the M2, pretty fast, right? But now we got to edit it, and that's the most important part. How smooth is this editing going to be in Final Cut Pro on the M2 MacBook Pro? Well, let's find out. All right, here it is. Yes, I have completely edited, well, except for this part, but everything else up until this part was edited on the M2 MacBook Pro, the base model with 8 gigabytes of memory. And the performance on this was good and bad. Now, what I mean by good is, for the most part, this thing flew through the video edit, a 4K video edit, really smoothly. This thing was fast. It rendered everything out really quickly. Timeline was mostly smooth until I started to have to add multiple streams of 4K onto this. And then, just like every other Apple Silicon Mac I've had with 8 gigabytes of memory, it started to stutter and it started to slow down a little bit because it was just using too much memory and it had to swap to the SSD. And there was just too much memory pressure to edit 4K video with multiple streams of 4K on this 8 gigabyte model. Now, I'm not saying it was impossible, right? Like, I still got the video done. The slowdowns were minor. They were annoying to me because I'm so used to having higher end memory configurations now in Apple Silicon where I don't face this issue anymore. But Could I get a 4K video edit done for my typical video workflow on an 8 GB machine? Yes, absolutely. Just a couple minor slowdowns here and there, dealing with memory pressure. So yeah, let me, listen. And what we know about the Apple Silicon architecture with performance, So that's the type of stuff that I have to deal with on some of these lower 8 GB machines. If I had 16 gigabytes of memory or 32 gigabytes of memory, you can get this up to 24 gigabytes of memory. Those orders aren't shipping until like the beginning of August though. You probably wouldn't have this problem. So am I satisfied with the M2 performance? Yes, as the chip itself, it seems to be fine, but just be forewarned, if you order a base 8 GB model, well, you might run into some of these common issues I've had, even on the older M1 machines. So I would say if you're doing stuff like video editing, I'd really spring for the 16 GB model, maybe even the 24. If you're dealing with 4K, maybe you can skate by, if you don't mind those little stuttering issues, or if you're dealing with lower resolution footage like 1080p. But either way, so far, I'm happy with the M2 chip. There's some things I still need to figure out with my benchmarks. Maybe my methodology was wrong when I was testing the M2 versus the M1 Pro Mac. Like I said, that M1 had more memory, and we're seeing some of the limits of that here. So maybe that was the issue. Let me know if I was wrong in the comments below. If you figured out maybe if my testing was a little flawed, let me know in the comments below. But either way, this is the M2 chip. We're in the next generation of Apple Silicon. It's exciting. My first bit of benchmarks with this on paper, the M2 is a stronger chip, and I'm very excited to see the evolution of this chip as we get into the M2 Pro, the M2 Max, the M2 Ultra, and all that good stuff. And obviously, even though this computer isn't that exciting, I am really, really excited to get my hands on that new redesigned M2 MacBook Air. But so far, that's gonna be it for this video. Hopefully you found the benchmarks interesting, and hopefully you found them helpful. If you want more information on this computer, I'm gonna try and do another video on it, detailing more of my use with it after using it for a longer period of time. I just got this and ran benchmarks, so I don't wanna give my full opinions on it yet. But stay tuned for that video. But otherwise, if you like the video, give me a like. You wanna see more on this MacBook and the M2 MacBook Air, get subscribed. And hopefully I'll see you all in the next few videos. Take care, everyone. Peace.